In this video, I'm going to demonstrate the basics of how to use the computer program SPSS. And I'm also going to demonstrate some of the basic functions you will need to know how to do when using SPSS to do your data analysis. Now, the first step is going to be to open the program. So typically, if you don't have an icon on your desktop that you can double click on to start SPSS, you need to go to your Start menu, go to All Programs, find the entry labeled IBM SPSS Statistics, and within that you should be able to find your program for IBM SPSS Statistics. I'm using version 22. If you have an earlier version, your entryway should look much like this. Now, once the program is open, you're going to be greeted by this entryway window, and you'll have to make a few choices here. You'll notice there is an area for tutorials here that will walk you through some of the basic functions which you can use as well. Typically, you're going to be asked to make a choice to either open a new file or create a new dataset file or open an existing file. We'll go over opening existing files a little bit later in this tutorial, but for now we're going to create our own new dataset. So we want to click on the new dataset option and then click OK. And so now what we'll see here is the data editor window, and this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time is we're working with data, creating files, and also doing analysis. So the first thing I want to direct your attention to is down here in the left-hand corner, you'll see two tabs. One is labeled Data View, the other is labeled Variable View. So in the Data View, in which we're in currently, this is where we're going to see data displayed. In the Variable View, this is where we create new variables and name each of our categories of data. So we'll get to that in just a second, but let's look at the data view here first. So this looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet. It has drop-down menus, much like you would see in Excel, so a lot of that should look pretty familiar if you've used Excel previously. So the first thing we want to do is look at what the columns and the rows will do for us. So the columns we see here that are labeled VAR are the variables. These are the categories of data that we're going to enter. So this could be someone's age, it could be someone's sex, it could be their time to complete a task, it could be grade in a class. That's where the actual data is going to be named and then entered. Now the rows along the left-hand side here, these represent an individual participant or individual subject. So row 1 is the data for individual number 1, row 2 for individual number 2, and so on. So the next thing we want to do is now create some variables and then enter in some data. So we need to go back to the variable view. So click on the variable view tab here in the lower left-hand corner. And now we'll see some columns here that will indicate the different kinds of information that we can provide for each of our variables. So the first thing we want to do is give the variable a name. Now, SPSS has some rules as far as what names are acceptable. So we want to try and keep these as descriptive as possible, but also as simple as possible. So for example, if one of your variables is going to be sex, you would just enter in the variable name sex. Now you can give it a much more specific name under label. So we could call that gender of participants, could be the official name that we want to give it, or the label that we want to give it. But sex is kind of a short and sweet description of what a variable might be. Now we can enter in another variable called age. And we can continue to add variables depending on what kind of data that we're interested in. Now the first thing we need to look at in the case of sex, let's say, which is a categorical variable, in other words, there's only so many categories of sex that there can be available to include as data, we want to give that a value. So we go to the values column here, and then we click on the cell associated with sex, and that's going to open up a new window for us. And this allows us to give sex labels. Now, typically when we give more detailed labels within the data window, we're going to use either numbers or words. And so very often we will use them interchangeably. So for example, we can give it a number value. In this case, we can give male 1, and then we give it its word label. So we enter the number 1 in the value, which is basically a code. We give it a word label, and then we click add. So for females, we can give them a number code of 2, then female, and we click add. Then we click OK. Now if we go back to the data view, here are our 2 variables that we added, and here let's now start to enter in some data. So let's say that we have 5 participants, and we have one of them is a male, so we enter in a 1 for that participant. And we, using the arrow keys, move over to the next variable. That person's age is 25 years. And now using the arrow key again, we go down to our next participant, and that is a female, so we enter in a 2, and her age is 35 years. And again, using my arrow key to navigate, which is typically the easiest, we have another male who's age 40. Our 4th participant is a female. Her age is 45. And then we go to our last participant, and that is also a female, and her age is 25. So now we have data entered in for our first few subjects here. Now, as you can see, we use the numeric code for sex in this instance, but you can switch it to the label code, the word code, if you would like. And how you do that is you find this little button here that has 2 tiles, a 1 and an A, look like Scrabble tiles, and then a purple arrow here. We click on that, and that will automatically switch from a numeric label to a word label if you have it set up that way. So if you'd rather see the words, you can toggle back and forth between the word label and the number label. Now, this data under age is numeric, so it doesn't have a word versus a number label because its scale of measurement is years, which is a numeric scale. Now, if we had more participants, we could continue to add data for more participants. We could also add more variables if we so choose. Now, let's go back to the variable label one more time, so I can give you an indication of what is not acceptable for a variable name in SPSS. SPSS does not like spaces in the name, so if we wanted to call something age group, there's a space there, and so when I hit enter, SPSS will tell me that's an illegal character. It does not like spaces. But if I call it age group, one continuous word, that's acceptable. What I can also do is place an underscore, and SPSS would find that acceptable. If I wanted to enter a dash in between my variable name, SPSS does not like that. It will accept an underscore, but it will not accept a dash. You can use numbers in your variable names. However, you cannot use symbols such as an ampersand or a $sign. Okay, now the next thing we can learn is how we can save this data file. Once we have created this data file, we may want to save it. So in order to do that, we need to go to the File menu and click Save As. Now, data files have a suffix of SAV, and that's how we know when we save them that this is a data file. We'll talk about output files in another video, which have a different suffix, but data files are saved with an SAV suffix. So we can call this sample data, and we can save it in that manner. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to to learn some basic techniques of opening and using SPSS. Additional videos will talk about additional types of activities that we can do, including creating charts and doing some basic analysis.